And Chapter 14 of The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White. In the autumn, everybody was preparing for the winter. At night, they spent most of the time rescuing daddy longlegs from their candles and rushlights. In the daytime, the cows were turned into the high stubble and weeds which had been left for the harvest sickles, while the pigs were driven into the purlieus of the forest, where boys beat the trees to supply them with acorns. Everybody was at a different job. From the granary there proceeded an inevitable thumping of flails. In the strip fields the slow and enormously heavy wooden plows sailed up and down for all day the rye and the wheat. Sailed up and down all day for the rye and the wheat, while the sowers swung rhythmically along with their hoffers round their necks, casting right hand for left foot, and vice versa. Foraging parties came lumbering in, with their spike-wheeled carts full of bracken, remarking wisely that they must "Git home with the brakes ere all summer be gone, for tethered-up cattle to sit down upon," while others dragged in timber for the castle fire. The forest rang in the sharp air with the sound of beetle and wedge. Everybody was happy. The villains were slaves if you chose to look at it the villains were slaves if you chose to look at it in one way, but if you chose to look at it in another, they were just the same farm laborers as starve on 30 shillings a week today, only neither villain nor the farm laborers did starve. It has never been an economic proposition for an owner of cattle to starve his cows, so why should an owner of slaves starve them? The truth is that nowadays the farm laborer is ready to accept so little money because he does not have to throw his soul in with the bargain, as he would have had to do in a town, and just the same freedom of spirit has obtained in the country since Sir Ector. The villains were laborers. They lived in the same one-roomed hut with their families, few chickens, litter of pigs, or cow possibly called Crumbaki, most dreadful and insanitary, but they liked it. They were healthy, quite free of an air, with no factory smoke in it, and, which was most of all, their heart's interest was bound up with their skill and labor. They knew that Sir Ector loved and was proud of them. They were more valuable to him even than his cattle, and as he valued his cattle more than anything else except his children, this was saying a good deal. He walked and worked among them, thought of their welfare, and could tell the good workmen from the bad. He was the eternal farmer. In fact, one of those people who seem to be employing labor at 30 shillings a week, but are actually paying half as much again in voluntary overtime, providing a cottage fee free at the nominal rent, and possibly making an extra present of their milk and eggs and home-brewed beer. So I'm going to pause, and this is me speaking, not the book. I do not necessarily agree with the sentiments that life as a slave is preferable to life as a free person. This book was written in 1939 as a protest against Hitler, but it was also written from a 1939 point of view. And does it suck to make minimum wage? Yes, it does. But we should never, I don't think, say being a slave in the Dark Ages was better than that, because it leads us down an uncomfortable road that I feel sometimes like here in the United States we're already part of the way down. So that's my editorial. Let's return to the story. Sir Ector now moved through all these activities with a brow of thunder, when an old lady who was sitting in a hedge by one of the strips of wheat in order to scare away the rooks and pigeons suddenly rose up beside him with an unearthly screech. He jumped a foot in the air. He was in a nervous state. "Dang it!" said Sir Ector. Then, considering the subject more attentively, he added in a loud, indignant voice, "Hell's bells and buckets of blood!" He took the letter out of his pocket and read it over again. The overlord of the castle of the Forest Sauvage was not only a farmer, he was a military captain, of course, who was prepared to organize and lead the defense of his estate, and he was a sportsman who occasionally took a day's jousting when he could spare the time, but he was more than these. Sir Ector was an MFH, or rather, Master of Stag and other hounds, and he hunted his own pack himself. Clumsy, Taunir, Phoebe, Collie, Gerland, Talbot, Luath, Lufra, Apollon, Orthros, Bran, Gellert, Bounce, Boy, Lion, Bungie, Toby, Diamond, and Cavil were not pet dogs. They were forest savage hounds, no subscription, 2 days a week. Huntsman the master. This is what the letter said, if we translate it out of Latin. The king to Sir Ector, sir. We send you William Twyty, our huntsman, and his fellows to hunt in the forest sauvage, with our boarhounds, Cannabis nostris porcarius, in order that they may capture 2 or 3 boars. You are to cause the flesh they capture to be salted and kept in good condition, but the skins you are to cause to be bleached, which they give you, as the said William shall tell you. And we commend you to provide necessities for them as long as they shall be with you by our command, and the cost of, etc., shall be accounted, etc. Witnessed at the Tower of London, 20 November, in the 12th year of our reign, Uther Pendragon, 12 Uther. Now the forest belonged to the king, and he had every right to send his hounds to hunt in it. Also he maintained a large number of hungry mouths, what with his court and his army, so that it was natural that he would want as many dead boars, bucks, roes, etc., to be salted down as possible. He was perfectly in the right. All this did not take away from the fact that Sir Ector regarded the forest as his forest, however, and resented the intrusion of the royal hounds, as if his own would not do just as well. The king had only to send for a couple of boars, and he would have been only too glad to supply them himself. He feared that his coverts would be disturbed by a lot of wild royal retainers. Never know what these city chaps will be up to next, and the king's huntsman, this fellow Twyty, would sneer at his humble hunting establishment, unsettle the hunt's servants, and perhaps even try to interfere with his own kennel management. In fact, Sir Ector was shy. Then there was another thing. Where the devil were the royal hounds to be kept? Was he, Sir Ector, to turn his own hounds into the street in order to put the king's hounds in his kennels? Hell's bells and buckets of blood, repeated the unhappy master. It was as bad as paying tithes. Sir Ector put the accursed letter in his pocket and stumped off up the ploughing. The villains, seeing him go, remarked cheerfully, "All well, master, be on the gad again, seemingly." It was a confounded piece of tyranny, that's what it was. It happened every year, but it still was that. He always solved the kennel problem in the same way, but it still worried him. He would have to invite his neighbors to the meet specially, so as to look as impressive as possible under the royal huntsman's eye. And this would mean sending messengers through the forest to Sir Grumorix, etc. Then he would have to show sport. The king had written early, so that evidently he intended to send the fellow at the very beginning of the season. The season did not begin till the 25th of December. Probably the chap would insist on one of those damned Boxing Day meets. All show off with no business, with hundreds of foot people all hollering and heading the boar and trampling down the seeds and spoiling sport generally. How the devil was one to know in November where the best boars would be on Boxing Day? What with the sounders and gorgons and hog stealers, you never knew where you were. And another thing, a hound that was going to be used next summer for the proper hart hunting was always entered at Christmas to the boar. It was the very beginning of his education, which led up through hares and whatnots to its real quarry. And this meant that the fellow Twyty would be bringing down a lot of raw puppies, which would be nothing but a plague to everybody. "Dang it!" Sir Ector said again, and stumped upon a piece of mud. He stood gloomily for a moment, watching his 2 boys trying to catch the last leaves in the chase. They had not gone out with that intention, and did not really, even in those distant days, believe that every leaf you caught would mean a happy month next year. Only as the west wind tore the golden rags away, they looked extremely fascinating and were difficult to catch. For the mere sport of catching them, of shouting and laughing, and feeling giddy as they looked up, and darting about to trap the creatures which were certainly alive in the cunning with which they slipped away, the two boys were prancing about like young fawns in the ruin of the year. The only chap, reflected Sir Ector, who could really be useful in showing the king's huntsmen proper sport was that fellow Robin Hood. Robin Wood, they seem to be calling him now. Some new-fangled idea, no doubt. But Wood or Hood, he was the chap to know where a fine tush was to be found. Been feasting on the creatures for months now. He wouldn't be surprised, even if they were out of season. But you couldn't very well ask a fellow to hunt up a few beasts of beanery for you, and then not invite him to the meet. Well, if you did invite him to the meet, what would the king's huntsmen and the neighbors say at having an outlaw as a fellow guest? Not that this Robin Wood wasn't a good fellow. He was a damn good fellow, and a good neighbor too. He had often tipped Sir Ector a wink when a raiding party was on its way from the marches, and never molested him or his farming in any way. What did it matter if he did chase himself a bit of venison now and then? There was 40 square miles of this forest, they said. Enough for all. Leave well alone. That was Sir Ector's motto. But that didn't alter the neighbors. Another thing was the riot. It was all very well for these crack hunts to be practically artificial forests, like at Windsor, where the king hunted, but it was quite a different thing in the forest sauvage. Suppose His Majesty's famous hounds was to go run and riot after a unicorn or something. Everybody knew that you could never catch a unicorn without a young virgin for bait, in which case the unicorn meekly laid its white head and mother-of-pearl horn in her lap, and so the puppies would go charging off into the forest for leagues and leagues and never catch it and get lost. And then what would Sir Ector say to his sovereign? It wasn't only unicorns. There was this beast Gallistant everyone had heard so much about. If you had the head of a serpent, the body of a leopard, and the haunches of a lion, and were footed like a hart, and especially if you made a noise like 30 couple of hounds questing, it stood to reason that you would account for an excessive number of royal puppies before they pulled you down. Serve them right, too. And what would King Pellinore say if Master William Twitey did succeed in killing his beast? Then there were the small dragons which lived under stones and hissed like kettles. Dangerous varmints, very. Or suppose they were to come across one of the really big dragons. The boy Wart had been talking for months about nothing except some dragon called Atlantic something or other, which was killed by a chap called St. George's. Suppose they was to run into one of them. Why, the boy said it was 115 feet long. Sir Ector considered the prospect moodily for some time, then began to feel better. It would be a jolly good thing, he concluded, if Master Twitey and his beastly dogs did meet Atlantic, what you may call it. Yes, and get eaten up by it too, every one. And we will pause there.